Margaret Stormcloud's weathered hands trembled as she lifted the leather-bound diary from her grandmother's cedar chest, the faded ink still legible after 52 years. The first line made her breath catch. They called it punishment, but God called it providence. This wasn't the love story she'd expected to find. It was a confession. The photograph tucked between the pages fluttered to the floor. A young Cherokee man and a white woman, both defiant, both desperate. Margaret's coffee cup shattered against the hardwood as recognition hit her like lightning. The woman's eyes were her own. Her grandmother Clara had been only 18 when they dragged her up Devil's Peak in chains, pregnant and disgraced, to marry a mountain man she'd never met. Everyone said Thomas Whitmore was protecting the family name. Everyone said Judge Hartwell was upholding Christian values. Everyone was wrong. "Mama, what's wrong?" her daughter called from the kitchen. But Margaret couldn't answer. Who was her real grandfather? And why had 3 generations of women kept this secret buried in the Colorado mountains? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Colorado Territory stretched wild and unforgiving in the summer of 1873, where Copper Ridge clung to the mountainside like a prayer whispered against the wind. The town had grown fat on coal and silver, its wooden sidewalks echoing with the boots of miners and the rustle of women's skirts hurrying past saloon doors. Church bells rang every Sunday, calling the faithful to worship under Judge Cornelius Hartwell's watchful eye, while the ungodly learned to fear his swift justice. Clara Rainwater had learned both lessons well. At 18, she possessed the kind of beauty that made men stumble over their own feet and women purse their lips in disapproval. Her dark hair caught sunlight like spun copper, and her green eyes held secrets that even she didn't fully understand. Raised by Thomas Whitmore after her mother's death in childbirth, Clara had grown up believing she was his cherished daughter, the apple of the coal baron's eye. The finest dresses, the best education the territory could offer, piano lessons from a teacher imported all the way from Denver, Thomas had spared no expense. But love, Clara was learning, came with a price that could bankrupt the soul. Thomas Whitmore stood at his office window now, watching the morning bustle below while his hands shook with the weight of terrible decisions. At 45, he'd built an empire from nothing but grit and determination, transforming a played-out mining claim into the most profitable operation in 3 counties. His workers respected him, his peers envied him, and his daughter, the girl he'd raised as his own, was about to destroy everything he'd built. Judge Hartwell's ultimatum echoed in his mind like a death knell. "Handle this situation, Thomas, or I'll handle it for you. That girl's shame will not infect this community." 30 miles up the treacherous mountain trail, Ezra Stormcloud tended his small garden with the precision of a man who understood that survival depended on attention to detail. At 35, the Cherokee doctor-turned-hermit had shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the world, though he'd grown tired of the burden years ago. His cabin sat perched on a granite ledge like an eagle's nest, commanding a view of the valley that stretched to the horizon. Most folks in Copper Ridge whispered that he was half wild, completely dangerous, and wholly unsuitable for civilized company. They were wrong about the first 2 assumptions and tragically correct about the third. Ezra had learned that civilization was often just cruelty dressed in Sunday clothes. The morning sun painted the peaks gold and crimson, a beauty that Ezra had stopped noticing until today. Today, something felt different. The wind carried a scent of change, of upheaval, of destiny approaching on horseback. He paused in his weeding, straightening to scan the valley below. Somewhere down there, decisions were being made that would alter the course of 3 lives forever. Somewhere down there, a young woman was about to learn that sometimes salvation came disguised as damnation, and sometimes the worst thing that happened to you became the best thing that ever could. The scandal broke on a Tuesday morning when Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton discovered Clara retching behind the church after choir practice. By Wednesday evening, the entire town of Copper Ridge knew that Thomas Whitmore's precious daughter was carrying a child out of wedlock. By Thursday, Judge Cornelius Hartwell was sitting in Thomas's parlor, his black coat spread around him like the wings of a vulture. 18 years I've watched that girl grow up under your roof, the judge said, his voice carrying the weight of divine judgment. 18 years of Sunday school, piano recitals, and proper Christian upbringing. And this is how she repays your kindness? Clara stood frozen outside the parlor door, her ear pressed against the wood, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. She could hear her father's labored breathing, the creak of his leather chair as he shifted uncomfortably. She's young, Cornelius. Young people make mistakes. Mistakes? The judge's fist slammed against the mahogany table. My son William is dead because of her wanton behavior. Dead at 19 because she filled his head with romantic nonsense and then shamed him publicly when he tried to do right by her. The words hit Clara like physical blows. William Hartwell had broken their engagement just 3 days before his riding accident, claiming he couldn't marry her after all. She'd been hurt, confused, but never imagined her rejection had driven him to his death. That's not fair, and you know it, Thomas said quietly. William's death was a tragedy, but nothing! Hartwell's voice rose to a roar. She corrupted my boy's mind, filled him with ideas about love and passion instead of duty and honor, and now she's carrying some bastard's child while my son lies cold in his grave. Clara's knees buckled. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her hands pressed over her mouth to stifle the sobs that threatened to escape. The baby, Marcus's baby, fluttered in her womb as if sensing her distress. What do you want me to do? Thomas's voice had aged 10 years in the span of their conversation. You know what needs to be done. The same thing any decent father would do when his daughter brings shame upon the family name. The judge's footsteps approached the door, and Clara scrambled to her feet, fleeing up the stairs on silent feet. There's a man up on Devil's Peak, Cherokee fellow, lives alone. He owes me a considerable debt. Clara pressed herself against the upstairs banister, straining to hear every word. You can't mean, Cornelius, she's just a child. She's old enough to spread her legs. She's old enough to face the consequences. The Cherokee will take her off your hands permanently. No one in town will ask questions. They'll assume she died in childbirth or ran off in shame. Either way, the problem disappears. I won't do it. I won't send Clara to some savage in the mountains. The silence stretched like a held breath. When Judge Hartwell spoke again, his voice was soft as silk and twice as dangerous. Then perhaps it's time the territorial government took a closer look at your mining operations, Thomas. I've heard rumors about safety violations, unpaid taxes, workers being cheated of their wages. Shame if your empire came crashing down just when your daughter needs you most. Clara heard her father's sharp intake of breath. She knew, as did everyone in Copper Ridge, that Judge Hartwell's word was law in these parts. One report from him could shut down the mines permanently, leaving hundreds of families destitute, and Thomas facing federal charges. You bastard, Thomas whispered. I'm a man of God doing God's work, Hartwell replied smoothly. The Cherokee goes by the name Ezra Stormcloud, former Army surgeon, been living up there for near 5 years now. He'll keep her alive, which is more mercy than she deserves. And if I refuse, then your daughter will face the territorial court for fornication and moral turpitude. She'll spend the next 5 years in the women's penitentiary, assuming she survives childbirth in a cell. Your choice, Thomas. The mountain or the gallows? Clara's world tilted on its axis. She gripped the banister until her knuckles went white. watching through the balusters as Judge Hartwell emerged from the parlor, his face a mask of righteous satisfaction. He paused at the bottom of the stairs, looking up as if he could see her crouched there in the shadows. 3 days, Thomas. I want her gone by Sunday. And if I hear so much as a whisper that she's anywhere within 100 miles of Copper Ridge after that, I'll assume you've decided to face the territorial authorities instead. The front door slammed with the finality of a coffin lid closing. Clara remained frozen on the stairs, watching her father emerge from the parlor like a broken man. He aged 20 years in the span of 20 minutes, his shoulders bowed under the weight of an impossible choice. Sunday was 3 days away, 3 days to say goodbye to everything she'd ever known, everyone she'd ever loved. 3 days before she'd be delivered to a stranger in the wilderness like a piece of unwanted cargo. The baby moved again, a gentle reminder that she wasn't facing this alone. Whatever lay ahead on Devil's Peak, she'd protect this child with her last breath. The journey to Devil's Peak began before dawn on Sunday, when the world was still painted in shades of gray, and the morning mist clung to the valley like grieving spirits. Clara sat rigid in the wagon bed, her few possessions bundled in a worn carpet bag, watching Copper Ridge disappear behind the pine trees with each turn of the wheels. Thomas hadn't spoken a word since loading her belongings, his jaw set like granite and his eyes fixed on the treacherous mountain trail ahead. The silence between father and daughter stretched taut as a bowstring, filled with all the words they couldn't bring themselves to say. Clara's hand rested protectively over her belly, where the child grew stronger each day, seemingly oblivious to the storm raging around its existence. She wanted to rage at Thomas, to scream and fight and demand he turn the wagon around, but the defeated slump of his shoulders told her everything she needed to know. He was as trapped as she was, caught between Judge Hartwell's threats and his love for the daughter who'd unknowingly destroyed his world. "Papa," she whispered as they climbed higher into the mountains, the air growing thin and sharp. "Please don't do this." Thomas's hands tightened on the reins, but he didn't turn around. "I wish I had a choice, Clara girl. Lord knows I wish I had a choice." The trail grew steeper and more treacherous with each mile, winding around granite outcroppings and across narrow wooden bridges that groaned under the wagon's weight. Far below, the valley spread like a patchwork quilt, peaceful and serene from this height, giving no hint of the cruelty that festered in its civilized heart. Clara had never been this far from town, never imagined such wild beauty existed so close to everything she'd known. By midday, they reached a clearing where the trail forked, one path leading deeper into the wilderness, the other beginning its descent back toward civilization. Thomas pulled the wagon to a halt beside a weathered wooden sign that read, "Storm Cloud, 2 miles," in faded black paint. The letters seemed to mock Clara with their stark finality. "This is where I leave you," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. He climbed down from the driver's seat with movements of an old man, though he was barely past 40. "The rest of the way, you walk." Clara stared at him in disbelief. "You're not even going to... You won't even see me safely delivered?" "I can't." Thomas's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "If I see that man, if I have to look him in the eye and hand you over like a piece of property, I'll do something we'll both regret. This way, at least I can pretend you chose to go." The cruelty of it hit her like a physical blow. Not only was she being abandoned, but she was expected to walk into her exile willingly, to spare her father's conscience the burden of witnessing what he'd been forced to do. Clara climbed down from the wagon on unsteady legs, her carpet bag clutched against her chest like armor. "The judge said this Storm Cloud fellow was a doctor," Thomas said, still unable to meet her eyes. "Army surgeon during the war. He'll see you through the birth safely." "And then what?" Clara's voice broke on the words. "What happens to me after that, Papa? What happens to your grandchild?" Thomas flinched as if she'd struck him. "I don't know, Clara girl. I honest to God don't know." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch heavy with coins. "It's not much, but it's all I could manage without arousing suspicion. Maybe it'll help somehow." Clara took the pouch with numb fingers, the weight of it meaningless against the enormity of what was happening. "I love you, Papa," she whispered. "Whatever else happens, I want you to know that." Thomas broke then, pulling her against his chest in a fierce embrace that smelled of tobacco and desperation. "I love you too, daughter, more than my own life. If there was any other way—" "I know." Clara pulled back, forcing herself to be strong for both of them. "I know you'd fight the whole world for me if you could." Thomas climbed back onto the wagon with the movements of a broken man. "Tell him," he said suddenly, not looking at her. "Tell this storm cloud that you're not unwilling. That it might make a difference." The wagon wheels creaked into motion, carrying Thomas back down the mountain and out of her life. Clara stood in the clearing until the sound faded completely, leaving her alone with the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. The 2-mile walk to Ezra Stormcloud's cabin felt like a journey to the edge of the world. The trail was little more than a deer path, winding through stands of aspen and pine that seemed to close in around her with each step. Clara's feet, accustomed to wooden sidewalks and parlor rugs, stumbled over roots and loose stones. Her dress, suitable for a lady's afternoon calls, caught on brambles and low-hanging branches. By the time she crested the final ridge, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The cabin appeared suddenly, as if conjured from the wilderness itself, a solid structure of hewn logs and native stone, perched on a granite ledge that commanded a view of the entire valley below. Smoke rose from the chimney in a steady gray column, and a well-tended garden stretched along the cabin's southern wall. Herbs hung drying from the eaves, and a neat wood pile stood ready for winter's cold. It was, Clara realized with surprise, a home rather than the primitive shelter she'd expected. A man emerged from around the back of the cabin, drawn by the sound of her approach. Clara's breath caught in her throat. This was no savage mountain hermit, but a tall, powerfully built Cherokee with intelligent dark eyes and silver threading through his black hair. He wore a simple cotton shirt and well-fitted trousers, his feet shod in moccasins that made no sound on the rocky ground. Ezra Stormcloud studied her for a long moment, taking in her torn dress, her wind-tangled hair, the carpet-bag clutched in her white-knuckled grip. His gaze lingered on the slight swell of her belly before returning to her face. "You must be Clara," he said finally, his voice cultured and precise, bearing only the faintest trace of an accent. "I've been expecting you." The words were spoken without warmth or welcome, but neither with cruelty. They were simply a statement of fact, as neutral as commenting on the weather. Clara found her voice at last, though it came out smaller than she'd intended. "Yes, sir. I'm Clara Rainwater." She paused, remembering Thomas's final words. "I want you to know that this arrangement isn't entirely unwilling on my part." Something flickered in Ezra's dark eyes, surprise, perhaps, or the faintest hint of amusement. "Is that so?" Clara lifted her chin, summoning the last of her courage. "I have nowhere else to go, and you've agreed to take me in. That makes you either very kind or very desperate. I'm hoping for the former." This time, Ezra's mouth definitely quirked upward at one corner. "Come inside, Clara Rainwater. We have much to discuss." The interior of Ezra's cabin defied every expectation Clara had harbored about mountain hermits and their dwellings. Books lined shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, their leather spines bearing titles in English, Cherokee, and what appeared to be Latin. Medical instruments gleamed in a glass-fronted cabinet, while dried herbs hung in neat bundles from the rafters. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth clean swept and ready for kindling. The floors were polished pine planks covered with woven rugs in patterns Clara didn't recognize but found oddly comforting. "Sit," Ezra said, gesturing toward a ladder-back chair beside the scrubbed pine table. "You look ready to collapse." Clara lowered herself gratefully into the chair, her legs trembling from the long walk and the shock of everything that had happened. Ezra moved around the cabin with quiet efficiency, stoking the fire and setting a kettle to boil. She watched him covertly, trying to reconcile this educated, well-spoken man with the savage hermit of Judge Hartwell's description. "You're not what I expected," she said finally. Ezra glanced at her over his shoulder. "Neither are you. Hartwell led me to believe you were a spoiled, willful girl who'd shamed her family. You're clearly spoiled. That dress probably cost more than most people see in a year, but willful?" He shrugged. "Willful girls don't walk into exile without a fight." "How do you know I didn't fight?" "Because you're here." He poured hot water over tea leaves in a ceramic pot, the ordinary domestic action somehow reassuring. "And because your father delivered you to the fork in the trail rather than my doorstep. A man ashamed of his daughter doesn't spare himself the final humiliation unless she asks him to." Clara stared at him in amazement. "How could you possibly know that?" "I know Judge Hartwell. I know how his mind works." Ezra's voice carried an edge of bitterness. "He demanded Thomas bring you here as punishment, but he also wanted Thomas to suffer every step of the way. Making your father hand you over personally would have been the cruelest twist of all." "You speak as if you know the judge well." "Well enough." Ezra poured tea into 2 cups, the fragrant steam rising between them like incense. "He's the reason I live on this mountain instead of practicing medicine in Denver or San Francisco." Clara accepted the cup with trembling hands, grateful for its warmth. "What did he do to you?" "The same thing he's doing to you. Used his power to destroy someone who threatened his sense of righteous order." Ezra settled into the chair across from her, his dark eyes studying her face. "But that's a story for another day. Right now, we need to discuss the terms of this arrangement." "Terms?" Clara's heart lurched. "I thought, that is, I assumed, that I'd simply accept you as chattel, that I'd exercise my conjugal rights without question because Hartwell said I could." Ezra's tone was mild, but his eyes flashed with something dangerous. "I may live like a hermit, Miss Rainwater, but I haven't forgotten how to be civilized." "It's Clara," she said softly, "and I didn't mean to offend you. I just don't understand what's expected of me here." Ezra leaned back in his chair, cradling his teacup. "What's expected is that you'll live here as my wife in name only until your child is born. After that, we'll reassess the situation based on what you want and what options are available to you." "Wife in name only?" Clara couldn't hide her confusion. "But surely Judge Hartwell expects me to be grateful for whatever scraps he throws my way. He's going to be disappointed." Ezra's smile was sharp as a blade. "I agreed to provide you with shelter and protection, Clara. Nothing more. What happens between us beyond that is our choice, not his." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, though whether from relief or something else entirely she couldn't say. "Why would you do that? Why would you risk angering him further?" "Because I've seen what happens when powerful men treat women like property to be traded." Ezra's voice softened slightly. "My grandmother used to say that kindness costs nothing, but pays dividends for a lifetime. I figure it's time I started investing." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door, 3 sharp raps that made both of them freeze. Ezra rose swiftly, his hand moving instinctively toward a rifle mounted above the fireplace. "Stay behind me," he commanded quietly, moving toward the door with the fluid grace of a predator, Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as Ezra cracked the door open, keeping his body between her and whoever stood outside. She heard a familiar voice and nearly collapsed with relief. "Well, aren't you going to invite your cousin inside, or should I make camp on your doorstep?" Ezra's posture relaxed, and he opened the door wider to reveal a younger Cherokee man with a deputy's badge pinned to his vest. "James, what brings you up the mountain?" Deputy James Crowfeather stepped into the cabin, his keen eyes immediately finding Clara. "Official business, unfortunately. Judge Hartwell sent me to verify that his arrangement has been properly completed." "It has," Ezra said curtly. "As you can see, Miss Rainwater has arrived safely." James nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "Ezra, we need to talk. Privately." Clara started to rise. "I can step outside." "No," Ezra said firmly. "Whatever James has to say concerns you as much as it does me." He fixed his cousin with a steady stare. "Speak plainly." James removed his hat, running his fingers through his black hair. "There's talk in town. Bad talk. Some folks think the judge went too easy on the girl, that she should have faced a territorial court instead of getting handed off to you like a prize." "What kind of talk?" Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. "The kind that ends with torches and rope," James replied grimly. "Reverend Morrison's been preaching about the corrupting influence of loose women, and his congregation's been listening. They think you seduced young William Hartwell and drove him to his death." Clara's teacup slipped from her nerveless fingers, shattering against the floor. "That's not true. William broke our engagement. He said he couldn't marry me, but he never said why. 3 days later, he was dead, and I was left to face the scandal alone." James exchanged a meaningful look with Ezra. "There's more. The circumstances of William's death. They're not what the judge has been telling people." "What do you mean?" Ezra's voice was dangerously quiet. "I was the one who found the body." "William didn't die in a riding accident, Ezra. His neck was broken, but not from a fall. Someone did it deliberately, made it look like an accident afterward." The cabin fell silent except for the crackle of the fire and Clara's sharp intake of breath. She pressed her hands over her mouth, stifling the sob that threatened to escape. "You're saying William was murdered?" Ezra's question hung in the air like smoke. "I'm saying William Hartwell was killed by someone strong enough to snap a grown man's neck with their bare hands. Someone who knew how to stage a scene, someone with a powerful reason to want him dead." Clara's mind reeled. But who would want to hurt William? He was sweet, gentle. He wouldn't hurt a fly. "That's just it," James said softly. "William wasn't supposed to be the one who died. The intended victim was someone else entirely." Before anyone could respond, another knock echoed through the cabin, this one urgent, almost frantic. Ezra motioned for silence, moving once again toward the door with his rifle in hand. "Ezra Stormcloud!" The voice outside was young, female, and filled with panic. "Please, if you're in there, I need help." Ezra opened the door to reveal a Cherokee girl of perhaps 16, her dress torn and muddy, her face streaked with tears and dirt. Behind her stood a horse, lathered with sweat and breathing hard. "Singing Bird?" Ezra caught the girl as she stumbled across the threshold. "What's happened?" "It's grandmother," the girl gasped. "She's dying, Uncle Ezra. The white doctor in town won't come to the reservation, and the army surgeon is 3 days' ride away. You're her only hope." Clara watched as Ezra's face transformed, professional concern replacing personal worry. "What are her symptoms?" "Fever, difficulty breathing, pain in her chest. She's been asking for you for 2 days, but I was afraid to come." "Afraid the white authorities would use it against you somehow." James stepped forward. "Ezra, you can't. If you leave the mountain now, after what I just told you about the mood in town—" "She's my grandmother," Ezra said simply. The woman who raised me, who taught me everything I know about healing. I won't let her die alone." Clara stood on unsteady legs. "Take me with you." All three of them stared at her as if she'd taken leave of her senses. "Absolutely not," Ezra said. "It's too dangerous. If someone recognizes you, they won't. I'll dress as Cherokee, keep my head down. But you'll need an assistant, someone to help with supplies and prepare medicines." Clara lifted her chin, channeling strength she didn't know she possessed. "I was trained as a lady, but that included basic nursing skills. I can be useful." "Clara, you don't understand what you're asking," James said gently. "The reservation is no place for a white woman right now. Tensions are running high on both sides." "Then it's perfect," Clara replied with a bitter smile. "I'm not welcome in the white world anymore, and I'm about to become part of the Cherokee world whether I like it or not. This seems like a good time to start learning what that means." Ezra studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. "You're certain about this?" "I'm certain that I'm tired of being treated like a helpless child. I'm certain that I want to do something useful instead of sitting here feeling sorry for myself. And I'm certain that if your grandmother is anything like you, she's worth taking risks for." Something shifted in Ezra's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or the beginning of respect. "Very well, but you follow my lead. You don't speak unless spoken to. And if I tell you to run, you run. Understood?" Clara nodded, her heart racing with a mixture of terror and excitement. For the first time since this nightmare began, she was making a choice instead of having choices made for her. "James, I need you to stay here," Ezra continued. "If anyone comes looking for us, tell them Clara took ill and I'm treating her. It'll buy us some time." "Ezra, this is madness. If something happens to either of you, then you'll have an interesting report to write for Judge Hartwell." Ezra was already moving, gathering medical supplies from the cabinet and stuffing them into a leather satchel. "Singing Bird, how long can your horse carry 2 riders?" "She's strong, Uncle. She can make it to the reservation if we don't push too hard." Clara watched this efficient preparation with growing amazement. In the space of an hour, she'd gone from exile to reluctant wife to medical assistant. Each transformation felt like shedding an old skin, revealing someone she'd never known existed beneath. "One more thing," Ezra said, turning to face her with an expression of grave seriousness. "Once we leave this cabin, there's no going back to who you were before. The Cherokee world has different rules, different expectations. Are you prepared for that?" Clara thought of Judge Hartwell's threats, her father's broken expression, the hostile whispers that would follow her for the rest of her life if she remained in the white world. Then she thought of William's mysterious death, the grandmother dying on the reservation, and the man standing before her who'd offered her shelter without expecting anything in return. "I stopped being Clara Whitmore the moment I climbed into that wagon," she said quietly. "Maybe it's time to find out who Clara Stormcloud might become." Ezra's eyes widened slightly at her use of his surname, but he didn't correct her. Instead, he handed her a faded calico dress and a pair of moccasins. "Change quickly. We leave in 10 minutes." As Clara retreated behind a blanket partition to change clothes, she heard the men speaking in low, urgent Cherokee. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. They were embarking on something dangerous, something that could have consequences none of them could fully foresee. But for the first time since discovering her pregnancy, Clara felt alive instead of merely surviving. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it as herself, not as Thomas Whitmore's shameful daughter or Judge Hartwell's convenient scapegoat, but as a woman choosing her own path through the wilderness of her changed life. The Cherokee Reservation sprawled across a valley bottom like a constellation of scattered stars, dozens of cabins and traditional dwellings connected by footpaths that meandered between vegetable gardens and livestock pens. Smoke rose from countless chimneys against the darkening sky, and the scent of cooking fires mingled with the earthy smell of approaching rain. Clara had never seen anything like it. A complete community existing parallel to the white world she'd known, yet utterly separate from it. "Stay close," Ezra murmured as they approached the first cluster of buildings. "And remember what I told you about eye contact." Clara nodded, keeping her gaze fixed on the ground as they walked. The calico dress Ezra had given her was worn soft with age, and the moccasins moved silently over the packed earth. Her hair was braided and covered with a simple headscarf, transforming her appearance so completely that she barely recognized herself when she'd caught her reflection in Ezra's shaving mirror. Children playing in the dusty spaces between cabins stopped to stare as they passed, their dark eyes curious but not hostile. Women working in gardens straightened to watch their progress, and Clara caught fragments of conversation in Cherokee that she couldn't understand but sensed was about her presence. "Uncle Ezra!" A boy of perhaps 10 came running toward them, his face bright with relief. "Grandmother Singing Crow has been asking for you. She says the spirits told her you were coming." Ezra's stride quickened. "How is she, little wolf?" "Bad. Very bad. Mother says she's preparing for the journey to the Nightland." Clara's heart clenched at the matter-of-fact way the child spoke of death. In her world, such topics were whispered about behind closed doors, shrouded in euphemism and false comfort. Here, death seemed to be acknowledged as simply another part of life's natural rhythm. They reached a cabin larger than the others, its walls decorated with painted symbols that seemed to dance in the flickering firelight visible through the windows. A group of women sat on the covered porch, their voices rising and falling in what Clara realized was some form of prayer or chant. One of the women, middle-aged with graying hair and intelligent eyes, rose as they approached. She spoke rapidly to Ezra in Cherokee, her tone urgent. Clara caught the word for time and another that might have meant late. "This is my aunt, Mary Crow Feather," Ezra said quietly to Clara. "James's mother. She says grandmother's been waiting for us, but her condition has worsened in the last hour." Mary's eyes fixed on Clara with frank curiosity, taking in her pale skin and green eyes despite the Cherokee clothing. She said something to Ezra that sounded like a question. "She wants to know if you're the white woman everyone's talking about," Ezra translated. "The one who was given to me by the judge." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced herself to meet Mary's gaze directly. "Tell her I'm grateful for her nephew's kindness, and I hope I can be useful here." Ezra translated, and Mary's expression softened slightly. She responded with a stream of Cherokee that made Ezra's eyebrows rise. "What did she say?" Clara asked. "She says you have honest eyes, and that Grandmother Singing Crow has been dreaming about a white woman who would help heal the divisions between our peoples. She thinks you might be the one from the dreams." Before Clara could respond to this unsettling news, they were ushered inside the cabin. The interior was dimly lit by oil lamps and filled with the scent of burning sage. In the center of the room, on a bed covered with beautiful woven blankets, lay an elderly Cherokee woman whose face was lined with age, but whose eyes still burned with fierce intelligence. Grandmother Singing Crow was clearly very ill. Her breathing was labored and shallow, and her skin had the grayish pallor that Clara recognized from her limited nursing experience as a sign of serious illness. But when the old woman's eyes found Ezra's face, they lit up with such joy that Clara felt tears prick her own eyes. "My grandson," Singing Crow whispered in accented English, her voice barely audible above the sound of her difficult breathing. "You came." Ezra knelt beside the bed, taking one of her weathered hands in both of his. "Of course I came, Grandmother. You taught me that family comes before everything else." The old woman's gaze shifted to Clara, studying her with an intensity that made Clara want to squirm. "And you brought the white girl. Good. The spirit said you would. Grandmother, this is Clara. She's going to help me take care of you." Singing Crow's hand shot out with surprising strength, grasping Clara's wrist and pulling her closer. "Sit, child. Let me look at you properly." Clara sank onto a low stool beside the bed, acutely aware of the dozen pairs of eyes watching her every move. The old woman's fingers were surprisingly warm as they traced the outline of Clara's face. "You carry new life," Singing Crow said matter-of-factly. "A daughter. She will be a bridge between worlds, this one." Clara's breath caught. She'd told no one the baby's sex. Indeed, she wasn't even certain herself. "How could you possibly know that?" "The same way I know you're not the spoiled white girl everyone thinks you are. The same way I know my grandson is going to fall in love with you, if he hasn't already." Singing Crow's eyes twinkled with mischief, despite her obvious pain. "Spirits tell me many things, child. Usually more than I want to know." Ezra cleared his throat, his cheeks darkening with embarrassment. "Grandmother, perhaps we should focus on your medical needs." "Bah, I'm dying, boy. Let an old woman have her fun while she can." But Singing Crow allowed Ezra to examine her, answering his questions about her symptoms with the patience of someone who understood the importance of accurate diagnosis. Clara watched in fascination as Ezra worked. His hands were gentle but thorough as he listened to Singing Crow's chest, checked her pulse, and examined her throat. His medical knowledge was clearly extensive, far more sophisticated than the folk remedies she'd expected from a mountain hermit. "It's pneumonia," Ezra said finally, his voice heavy with concern. "Advanced, but not necessarily fatal if we can break the fever and clear her lungs." "What do you need?" Clara asked, surprised by her own boldness. Ezra looked at her appraisingly. "Can you prepare willow bark tea? The fever needs to come down first." "I can try." Clara had watched the cook at home prepare various herbal remedies, though she'd never made them herself. "Mary will show you where the supplies are kept," Ezra said. "We'll need steady doses every 2 hours through the night." As Clara worked alongside Mary Crow Feather to prepare the medicine, she became aware of the subtle ways the Cherokee women were watching her. Not with hostility exactly, but with the careful assessment of people deciding whether to trust a stranger. She tried to remember everything she'd learned about proper behavior, keeping her voice soft and her movements respectful. "You know healing plants?" Mary asked in careful English as they ground willow bark in a wooden mortar. "A little. My father's cook taught me some things." Clara hesitated, then decided on honesty. "But I'm willing to learn more if you'll teach me." Mary's expression warmed slightly. "Cherokee women learn healing from mothers, grandmothers. You have no Cherokee mothers." "No," Clara agreed sadly. "I don't have any kind of mother anymore." Something in her tone must have conveyed her loneliness, because Mary's hand briefly touched her shoulder in a gesture of comfort. "Maybe you find Cherokee mothers here, if you prove worthy." The night that followed was the longest of Clara's life. She and Ezra took turns sitting with Singing Crow, monitoring her breathing, administering medicine, and applying cool cloths to her fevered skin. Clara had never been so close to serious illness before, and the responsibility was both terrifying and oddly exhilarating. "You're a natural at this," Ezra murmured during one of their quiet conversations in the early morning hours. "Have you considered that you might have a calling for healing work?" Clara almost laughed at the irony. "Ladies in my social circle aren't supposed to have callings beyond marriage and motherhood. We're trained to arrange flowers and play piano, not to tend the sick. And yet here you are, tending the sick with more skill than many trained nurses I've known." There was something in his tone that made Clara look at him more closely. In the lamplight, his face was thoughtful, almost tender, as he watched her adjust Singing Crow's blankets. "Ezra," she said quietly, "can I ask you something? Why did you really agree to take me in? Judge Hartwell may have pressured you, but you could have refused. You could have left the territory entirely." Ezra was quiet for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I know what it feels like to be cast out of the only world you've ever known. I know what it's like to have powerful men destroy your life because it suits their purposes." He met her eyes directly. "And because the moment I saw you standing on my doorstep, I knew that Judge Hartwell had made a critical error in judgment." "What kind of error?" "He thought he was punishing you by sending you to me. Instead, he may have just saved both our lives." Before Clara could ask what he meant, Singing Crow stirred, her breathing easier than it had been in hours. The crisis point of her illness had passed, and though she was still weak, the immediate danger was over. "Well done, both of you," the old woman whispered, her voice stronger than before. "I think I'll live to see a few more sunrises after all." Relief flooded through Clara with such intensity that she had to grip the edge of the bed to steady herself. "Thank God," she breathed. "Thank the spirits," Singing Crow corrected with a weak smile. "And thank my grandson for knowing when to trust his instincts about people." As dawn broke over the reservation, Clara found herself helping Mary prepare breakfast for the extended family that had gathered to keep vigil. The rhythms of communal life were different here, more interconnected, more openly supportive than anything she'd experienced in the competitive social world of Copper Ridge. "You did good work last night," Mary said as they cooked cornbread over the fire. "Grandmother Singing Crow is difficult patient. She doesn't like white doctors. She seems to like me well enough. Because you listen. You don't try to tell Cherokee people what's best for them. You ask questions, you learn." Mary studied Clara's face carefully. "This is rare in white people." Clara felt a flush of pride at the unexpected compliment. "I'm finding that most of what I was taught about Cherokee people was wrong." "I was told you were savages, but everyone here has been more civilized than the people who banished me." "White men call us savages when they want our land," Mary said pragmatically. "They call us noble when they want to feel good about taking it. Truth is, we're just people. Some good, some bad, most somewhere in between." As they prepared to return to Ezra's cabin that afternoon, Clara realized something fundamental had shifted during the night. She'd proven to herself and to the Cherokee community that she was capable of more than ornamental usefulness. More importantly, she'd discovered that she genuinely enjoyed the work of healing, the satisfaction of using her hands and mind to ease suffering. "Grandmother wants to speak with you before you go," Ezra said, emerging from the cabin where he'd been making final medical preparations. Clara found the old woman sitting up in bed, looking remarkably better than she had the night before. Singing Crow's eyes were clear and alert as she beckoned Clara closer. "You have good hands for healing," the old woman said without preamble. "Strong but gentle. Cherokee hands, even though you're white." "Thank you, Grandmother. That means more to me than you know. I want you to come back. Learn Cherokee medicine ways. Your daughter will need to know both worlds if she's going to heal the divisions between them." Clara's heart skipped. "You really believe the baby is a girl?" "I know she is. Just like I know she's not the white boy's child you've been thinking about. She belongs to someone closer to your heart than that." The implications of this statement hit Clara like a physical blow. If Singing Crow was right, if the baby wasn't William's, then there was only one other possibility: Marcus. Her adoptive brother, the young man who'd been her closest friend and confidant, who'd comforted her after William's rejection with gentle kisses that had somehow turned into passionate embraces. How could you possibly know that? Clara whispered. Singing Crow smiled mysteriously. Spirits tell me many things. They also tell me that the Father is closer than you think, and the danger is greater than any of you realize. Before Clara could ask what that meant, Ezra appeared in the doorway. Clara, we need to go. James sent word that there's been developments in town. The ride back to Devil's Peak passed in tense silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Clara's mind reeled with Singing Crow's revelations, while Ezra seemed preoccupied with whatever news James had sent. As they crested the final ridge before his cabin came into view, Ezra suddenly pulled his horse to a halt. Clara, he said quietly, no matter what we find when we get home, I want you to know that last night was important for both of us. Important how? It showed me that Judge Hartwell made an even bigger mistake than I originally thought. He didn't just save your life by sending you to me. He may have given us both a chance at something neither of us expected to find. Clara's heart began to race. And what's that? Ezra's dark eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. A reason to fight for a future worth living. The smoke rising from the valley below wasn't the gentle gray of cooking fires or hearth warmth. It was black, thick, and angry. The smoke of destruction. Clara's blood turned to ice as she recognized the direction it was coming from, the Cherokee reservation they'd left just hours before. Dear God, she whispered, clutching the horse's mane as Ezra spurred their mount into a gallop down the treacherous mountain trail. Grandmother, Singing Crow. Hold on, Ezra commanded, his voice tight with fear and rage. The horse's hooves struck sparks from the rocky path as they descended at a pace that would have been suicidal in daylight, let alone in the gathering dusk. They smelled it before they saw it. The acrid stench of burning wood, fabric, and worse things that Clara's mind refused to identify. The reservation that had been a living community of families and hope that morning was now a hellscape of smoldering ruins and scattered bodies. Cabins that had stood for generations were reduced to blackened frames. Gardens that had fed families lay trampled under the hooves of horses and boots of men. Ezra leaped from the horse before it had fully stopped, racing toward the largest cabin, the one where Grandmother Singing Crow had been recovering. Clara followed, her heart hammering against her ribs as she took in the devastation. Women keened over the bodies of children. Men knelt beside their fallen brothers, their faces masks of grief and rage. The cabin was still standing, though its walls were riddled with bullet holes and its windows blown out. Inside they found Deputy James Crow Feather kneeling beside a figure on the floor, his uniform torn and bloody, his young face aged 10 years by what he'd witnessed. James! Ezra dropped to his knees beside his cousin. What happened here? Who did this? James looked up with eyes that had seen too much. Judge Hartwell. He came with a posse of 20 men, claimed he had reports of illegal weapons being stored on reservation land, said it was a territorial enforcement action. Where's Grandmother? Clara's voice was barely a whisper. James's face crumpled. They shot her when she tried to protect the children, 84 years old, and she died with a rifle in her hands, defending babies who weren't even her blood kin. Clara's legs gave out. She sank to the floor beside the covered form that had been the wise, sharp-tongued woman who'd seen so much in such a short time. The woman who'd spoken of spirits and bridges between worlds, who'd believed Clara's unborn daughter would somehow heal the divisions between peoples. This is my fault, Clara whispered, the words torn from her throat like shards of glass. He did this because of me, because I was here, because I helped her. No. Ezra's voice cut through her self-recrimination like a blade. This is Hartwell's fault. His alone. He used your presence here as an excuse, but this was always his plan. What do you mean? James struggled to his feet, swaying slightly from blood loss. Think about it, Ezra said, his medical training taking over as he examined James's wounds. Why would he risk attacking a federal reservation over one pregnant white woman? Why mobilize 20 armed men for what was supposed to be a simple delivery of unwanted goods? Clara felt something cold and terrible unfurling in her chest. Because he was never planning to let me live long enough to tell anyone what I knew. What could you possibly know that would threaten a territorial judge? James asked, wincing as Ezra cleaned a bullet graze on his arm. I don't know yet, Clara said slowly, her mind racing. But whatever it is, he's willing to massacre an entire community to keep it secret. A new voice cut through their conversation, young, breathless, filled with terror. Uncle Ezra? Uncle Ezra! They're coming back! Little Wolf, the boy who'd greeted them that morning, came stumbling through the ruined doorway. His clothes were singed and torn, his face streaked with smoke and tears. Who's coming back? Ezra caught the boy as he collapsed. The white men with the judge. They're riding up the mountain trail toward your cabin. I heard them talking. They said they were going to finish what they started. Clara's blood turned to ice. How many? 10, maybe 12, and they're carrying torches. Ezra's face went deadly calm, the expression of a man making calculations about survival and acceptable losses. James, can you ride? I can manage. Take Little Wolf and as many survivors as can travel. Head for the territorial capital. Find the federal marshal and tell him what happened here. What about you? Ezra met Clara's eyes, and she saw her own grim determination reflected there. We're going to end this. Tonight? Ezra, no! James struggled to his feet. You can't face 12 armed men alone. It's suicide. I won't be alone. Clara stood, her hands instinctively protective over her belly. And we won't be facing them. They'll be walking into a trap. Both men stared at her as if she'd taken leave of her senses. Clara, Ezra said gently, you're pregnant, exhausted, and these men are armed killers. These men are also arrogant, overconfident, and stupid, Clara interrupted. They think they're hunting a helpless woman and a hermit doctor. They have no idea what they're actually walking into. And what exactly are they walking into? James asked. Clara's smile was sharp as winter steel. A woman who's tired of running, and a man who knows every inch of his mountain, plus whatever weapons and advantages we can improvise in the next 2 hours. Clara, this is madness. This whole situation is madness. Clara's voice rose to match the fury burning in her chest. Judge Hartwell killed his own son, murdered dozens of innocent people, and plans to kill me and my unborn child to cover his crimes. I won't spend what might be my last night on earth cowering in a corner. If I'm going to die, I'm going to die fighting. Ezra studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. What did you have in mind? You know your mountain better than anyone. Where would you go if you wanted to ambush someone approaching your cabin? There's a narrow pass about a mile down from the cabin. High rocks on both sides, only one way through. Anyone approaching would be completely exposed. Perfect. What about weapons? I have my rifle, a shotgun, and some handguns, plus medical supplies that could be repurposed. Clara raised an eyebrow. Repurposed how? Chloroform, laudanum, various compounds that could incapacitate rather than kill. Ezra's smile was grim. I prefer not to take lives if I can avoid it, but I'm not opposed to making people very uncomfortable. James shook his head in amazement. You're both completely insane. You know that, right? Probably, Clara agreed. But we're also right. And sometimes being right and insane is better than being sane and dead. As they prepared to leave the devastated reservation, Clara knelt beside Grandmother, singing Crow's Still Form one last time. The old woman's face was peaceful despite the violence of her death, as if she'd found something in her final moments that transcended fear. "I promise you," Clara whispered, "your death won't be meaningless. Whatever it takes, I'll make sure the world knows what kind of man Cornelius Hartwell really is." The ride back up the mountain was a nightmare of switchback trails and loose scree, made worse by the knowledge that their enemies were climbing the same path somewhere behind them. But Clara felt something she hadn't experienced since this ordeal began: purpose. For the first time since discovering her pregnancy, she wasn't just surviving. She was fighting back. "There's something else," Ezra said as they neared the pass where they planned to make their stand. "Something I haven't told you about why Hartwell has such power over me." "What?" 5 years ago, I was accused of murdering a patient during surgery, a wealthy white woman whose husband had political connections. The charges were false. She died of complications no surgeon could have prevented, but Hartwell was the territorial judge who could have cleared my name. Clara felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. But he didn't. He offered to, for a price. He wanted me to disappear into the mountains, to be available when he needed certain services, performed medical procedures that required discretion. "What kind of procedures?" Ezra's jaw tightened. "The kind that help powerful men cover up inconvenient pregnancies. The kind that sometimes go wrong and require someone to dispose of the evidence." Clara's blood ran cold. "He's been using you to clean up after his friends' indiscretions, and to eliminate the women who might cause problems afterward." Ezra's voice was flat, emotionless. "I think you were supposed to be another one of those eliminations, Clara. I think I was supposed to be the weapon that killed you." The full scope of Judge Hartwell's corruption hit Clara like a physical blow. He hadn't just been covering up his own sins. He'd been orchestrating a system of exploitation and murder that reached into every level of territorial society. "But you didn't," she said softly. "Kill me, I mean." "No. And that's why everyone at the reservation had to die." "Because I chose to protect you instead of eliminating you, Hartwell lost control of his perfect setup." Clara reached across the space between their horses and took his hand. "Then we finish this together. For Grandmother Singing Crow, for all those people who died today, and for the child who deserves to be born into a world where men like Hartwell don't hold the power of life and death over innocent people." Ezra squeezed her fingers, his dark eyes burning with determination. Together. The ambush point was perfect, a narrow defile between two towering granite walls where the mountain trail squeezed into a passage barely wide enough for 2 horses abreast. Ancient pines clung to impossible ledges above, their roots finding purchase in cracks that seemed no wider than knife blades. In daylight, it would have been beautiful. In the torch-lit darkness, with armed men approaching, it felt like the gates of hell. Clara crouched behind a boulder the size of a small cabin, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would give away their position. The rifle Ezra had pressed into her hands felt foreign and dangerous, its weight both reassuring and terrifying. She'd never fired a gun in anger, never pointed a weapon at another human being with the intent to harm. The genteel world that had shaped her first 18 years had never prepared her for this moment. "Remember," Ezra whispered from his position across the narrow pass, "wait for my signal." "Aim for their horses if you can. We want them scattered and confused, not martyred." Clara nodded, though she wasn't sure he could see the gesture in the darkness. Below them, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls like distant thunder. Judge Hartwell's men were coming, and they were making no attempt at stealth. Why should they? They believed they were hunting a helpless woman and an isolated hermit, not walking into a carefully prepared trap. The first torch appeared around the bend like a malevolent star, followed by another, then another. Clara counted 12 riders in total, just as Little Wolf had reported. Judge Hartwell rode at their head, his black coat making him nearly invisible except for the pale blur of his face beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Spread out when we reach the cabin," Hartwell's voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air. "I want that Cherokee bastard taken alive if possible. The woman too. They both have questions to answer before they die." Clara's blood turned to ice at the casual cruelty in his tone. This wasn't justice or law enforcement. It was murder planned and executed with the cold efficiency of a business transaction. As the riders entered the narrow passage, Ezra's signal came. 3 low, haunting notes that might have been mistaken for an owl's call if anyone had been listening for such things. Clara took careful aim at the lead horse, said a quick prayer to whatever gods might be listening, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report crashed through the canyon like the voice of an angry mountain, followed immediately by Ezra's shotgun blast from the opposite side. The lead horse screamed and reared, dumping Judge Hartwell into the rocky dirt as chaos erupted around him. "Ambush!" someone shouted, though the observation was unnecessary. Horses bucked and plunged in the confined space, their riders fighting to control terrified animals while trying to locate their attackers in the darkness above. Clara worked the rifle's bolt action with fingers that shook only slightly, chambering another round as she shifted to a new position. Her next shot took down a man's horse, sending both rider and mount crashing into the canyon wall. She felt a stab of guilt for the animal, but Ezra was right. Scattered and confused enemies were preferable to organized ones. "There! Up on the rocks!" One of Hartwell's men had spotted muzzle flash and was returning fire, his bullet sparking off granite inches from Clara's head. She ducked lower, working her way to yet another position as the night air filled with the thunder of gunfire and the screams of wounded horses. Ezra's voice rose above the chaos, speaking Cherokee words she didn't understand, but that seemed to make their attackers even more frantic. "It's the whole damn tribe," another voice shouted. "We're outnumbered." Clara almost smiled despite the danger. Ezra was making them believe they'd walked into a much larger force, using echoes and misdirection to multiply their apparent numbers. Several of Hartwell's men were already retreating, their horses slipping and stumbling on the rocky trail as they fled back down the mountain. But Judge Hartwell himself wasn't retreating. Clara could see him crouched behind a fallen horse, his own rifle trained on the rocks where he thought she was hiding. Even in the chaos, his attention was focused entirely on her, not on escape, not on survival, but on finishing what he'd started. "Clara Rainwater!" His voice cut through the gunfire like a blade. "I know you're up there, you murdering whore. You think you can hide behind your savage protector forever?" The words hit her like physical blows, but they also crystallized something cold and hard in her chest. This man had destroyed her life, murdered her adoptive family's reputation, slaughtered innocent people, and planned to kill her unborn child. The time for fear was over. "My name," she called back, her voice carrying clearly in the mountain air, "is Clara Stormcloud, and I'm not hiding from anything anymore." She moved again, finding a new angle, and put her next shot close enough to Hartwell's position to send rock chips flying into his face. The judge cursed and returned fire, but his shot went wide, striking nothing but empty air where she'd been moments before. The battle was turning. Most of Hartwell's men had fled or been unhorsed, leaving only the judge and 3 of his most loyal followers still in the fight. But those 4 were determined, and they'd found defensive positions among the rocks and fallen animals. "Ezra!" Clara called out during a lull in the shooting. "Are you hit?" "Still breathing," came his reply from across the canyon. "But we need to end this soon. They're regrouping." He was right. The remaining men were using hand signals to coordinate their movements, preparing for a final assault on the positions where they believed their attackers were hiding. Clara realized with growing dread that their advantage was slipping away. That's when she heard it, the sound that changed everything. hoofbeats, approaching fast from down the mountain. But these weren't retreating men returning. The rhythm was all wrong. These horses were fresh, their riders organized, moving with the discipline of trained cavalry. "Judge Hartwell!" The voice that echoed through the canyon was young, strong, and filled with authority. "This is Deputy Marshal Thompson of the U.S. Territorial Service. You and your men are surrounded. Throw down your weapons and surrender." Clara's heart leaped. James had made it to the territorial capital. He'd found the federal marshal and brought help. But Judge Hartwell's response wasn't surrender. Instead, his voice rose to a roar of pure rage. "Thompson, you have no jurisdiction here. This is territorial law enforcement. Massacring federal reservation residents isn't law enforcement, Hartwell. It's murder, and I have jurisdiction over that." The judge's answer was a rifle shot aimed not at the approaching marshals, but up at the rocks where he believed Clara was hiding. The bullet struck stone inches from her head, showering her with granite chips. "If I'm going down," Hartwell screamed, "that murdering bitch goes with me!" He was moving now, scrambling up the rocky slope with the desperate strength of a man who had nothing left to lose. Clara saw him coming, saw the wild hatred in his eyes, the foam on his lips, the way he held his rifle like a club rather than a firearm. She tried to bring her own weapon to bear, but the angle was wrong, and Hartwell was moving too fast. In seconds, he'd be close enough to— The shot came from across the canyon. Ezra's rifle spoke once, a sound like thunder in the confined space, and Judge Cornelius Hartwell pitched forward onto the rocky slope. His rifle clattered away into the darkness as he rolled several feet before coming to rest against a boulder. Clara stared down at the still form, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The man who'd destroyed so many lives, who'd terrorized an entire territory with his corruption and cruelty, was finally still. "Clara!" Ezra was calling her name, his voice tight with concern. "Are you hurt?" "No," she called back, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "No, I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. As the immediate danger passed and reaction set in, Clara felt her legs give out beneath her. She slid down the rock face to sit heavily on a narrow ledge, her rifle forgotten as the magnitude of what they'd just experienced hit her. They'd survived. Against all odds, outnumbered and outgunned, they'd survived. More than that, they'd won. Judge Hartwell's reign of terror was over, his network of corruption exposed, his victims finally avenged. Below in the canyon, she could hear Deputy Marshal Thompson taking charge of the situation, organizing his men to secure the scene and tend to the wounded. The sound of civilization returning, of law and order being restored by honest men rather than corrupt ones. "Clara." Ezra's voice was closer now. She looked up to see him climbing carefully down the rock face toward her position, his face etched with concern and something deeper. Relief, perhaps, or the beginning of hope. "It's over," she said wonderingly. "It's really over." "Yes," he agreed, settling beside her on the narrow ledge. "It's over." But even as he spoke the words, Clara felt something else beginning, not an ending, but a transformation. She was no longer the sheltered daughter of Thomas Whitmore, no longer the disgraced girl who'd been cast out in shame. She was Clara Stormcloud, a woman who'd fought for her life and won, who'd faced down corruption and cruelty and emerged victorious. The question now was, what would she become next? 3 months later, Clara stood on the porch of the cabin that had become her home, watching the sun paint the Colorado peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Her belly had grown round and full, the baby moving constantly now as if eager to join the world that had been made safer by their courage. In her hands she held a letter that had arrived that morning with the mail delivery, the first official correspondence to reach Devil's Peak since the territorial investigation had concluded. "Mrs. Stormcloud," the letter began, and Clara smiled at seeing her chosen name written in formal script. The federal investigation had uncovered the full scope of Judge Hartwell's corruption network, leading to arrests across 3 territories and the complete reorganization of the territorial court system. More importantly for Clara's personal peace, Thomas Whitmore had been cleared of all wrongdoing and had sent word that he was selling his mining interest to establish a trust fund for her and the baby. Ezra emerged from the cabin behind her, his arms sliding around her waist as he rested his chin on her shoulder. "Good news?" "The best," Clara replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "Thomas wants to visit when the baby is born. He's been pardoned by the territorial governor and wants to be a grandfather, if we'll let him." "Of course we will. Family is family, however it's formed." They'd been married in a Cherokee ceremony 3 weeks after the confrontation in the canyon, with Grandmother Singing Crow's great-niece performing the ritual that bound them together in the eyes of both worlds. Clara had kept Ezra's surname not as submission to convention, but as a choice, a declaration that she was building something new from the ashes of who she used to be. "There's something else," Clara said, turning in his arms to face him. "Deputy Marshal Thompson wants Ezra Stormcloud, M.D., to consider a position as Territorial Medical Examiner. Official recognition, full reinstatement of your medical credentials, and a chance to help prevent another corruption network from taking root." Ezra's eyebrows rose. "And what does Clara Stormcloud think about that?" "Clara Stormcloud thinks her husband would be brilliant at it. She also thinks the territory needs doctors who understand that healing isn't just about medicine. It's about justice, compassion, and building bridges between different worlds." Before Ezra could respond, Clara felt a familiar tightening across her belly, stronger than the practice contractions she'd been experiencing for weeks. She gasped, her hand flying to her stomach. "Clara?" Ezra's medical training kicked in instantly, his hands moving to support her as another contraction followed the first. "I think," Clara said with a mixture of excitement and nervous laughter, "our daughter has decided she's ready to meet her parents." As Ezra helped her inside to prepare for the birth of their child, Clara felt the last pieces of her old life finally fall away. She was no longer Clara Rainwater, the disgraced daughter of Copper Ridge. She was Clara Stormcloud, wife, soon-to-be mother, and a woman who had learned that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the doorway to the best life you never imagined possible. Their daughter would be born free, legitimate, and loved, a bridge between worlds, just as Grandmother Singing Crow had prophesied. And she would grow up knowing that love, real love, was worth fighting for. Sometimes, life's greatest blessings come disguised as our worst punishments. Clara's story reminds us that when the world seems determined to break us, we might actually be on the verge of finding our truest selves. How many of us have looked back on our darkest moments and realized they led us exactly where we needed to be? In our golden years, we understand that real love isn't the fairy tale romance of our youth. It's the quiet strength of 2 people choosing each other every day, building something beautiful from broken pieces. Clara found her home not in the mansion of her birth, but in a mountain cabin, with a man who saw her worth when society saw only shame. She discovered that family isn't always blood, that courage isn't the absence of fear but action despite it, and that sometimes being cast out by one world means being welcomed into a better one. Her daughter grew up knowing she was wanted, cherished, and born from a love that conquered impossible odds. That's the kind of legacy that echoes through generations, not wealth or status, but the knowledge that love always finds a way. What moment in your life that seemed like a punishment actually became your greatest blessing? Have you ever found unexpected love or family in the most unlikely places? Share your story in the comments below.